I'm going to be, I think, slightly controversial and say something that maybe not everybody agrees with, which is I think 2024, the year of elections, has been a pretty successful year for democracy.
Is democracy dead? Do elections work anymore? In 2024, did all these elections we had actually represent the authentic will of the people? And furthermore, is genuine electoral democracy with checks and balances just passé? Is it even possible in the mid-21st century? I'm Jason Pack, and this is Disorder, the show where we try to find a semblance of order in our mad world. It's also the show where, when that semblance of order is not discoverable, we don't try to sugarcoat things, and we try to understand the structural dynamics at play in our age of disorder. So today, we're going to pivot to talking about those potentially passé concepts. Oh, you know, democracy and elections. In the wake of the world historical paroxysm that was the re-election of Donald J. Trump as President of the United States, we are not surprised by his moves to exert ever tighter control over the institutional checks and balances to his power, and his desire to align the world's most powerful democracy with many of the world's most powerful autocrats. All of these beg the question, is democracy itself alive? With the traditional media and press withering on the vine due to its funding model being disrupted, and the rise of disinformation, ideological filter bubbles, and opposing political parties no longer agreeing on so-called neutral facts, can democracy in its normal Western incarnation function? Or for democracy to survive, does it need to be reinvented? Now, I want to start with a controversial idea. And this is that mid-21st century democracy is going to need to look quite different than late 20th century democracy. But that's not surprising, and it's not necessarily insurmountable. We have to keep in mind that mid-19th century democracy was wildly different in the US and the UK than it would be 100 years later. In the mid-19th century, the franchise was restricted to property-holding men in the UK, and less than 10% of the population could vote. And in the US, prior to Jackson's changes, you had less than 5% of the population voting. The point is, these things change. And to deal with the ideas and structural issues of the time, how democracy and elections work changes. So I'm hoping we can use this very special episode to investigate the state of electoral democracy across the globe. As we make this around the globe tour, we're super honored to be joined by one of the world's leading experts in democracy and elections. Ben Ansell is professor of comparative democratic institutions at the University of Oxford and Nuffield College. He was the 2023 BBC Reith lecturer and presenter of the show What's Wrong with Democracy with Tortoise Media, and also the program Rethink on BBC Radio 4. His most recent book is Why Politics Fails, and he writes the Substack Political Calculus. We're going to have links to this amazing diversity and depth of output in the show notes. Welcome to Disorder, Ben.
Thank you so much for having me here, Jason.
I wish we were having this chat under quote-unquote better circumstances, but we have to face the world as it is. So I want to toss out a really easy, simple, and terribly unimportant question. Does democracy still work in the age of social media, AI, and influence campaigns?
I'm going to be, I think, slightly controversial and say something that maybe not everybody agrees with, which is I think 2024, the year of elections, has been a pretty successful year for democracy, given what we might have thought had we had this conversation this time last year in December 2023. So Maria Ressa, the Filipino journalist who won the Nobel Peace Prize, she in 2023 had said that this year, 2024, was the year where we would learn whether democracy would fall off a cliff. So elections have not gone the way that everybody would want them to go if you are, let's say, a Democrat in the US, or indeed if you are somebody who wanted Georgia to join the EU. But elections have happened freely and fairly in almost all of the cases where we had worries, Georgia being, unfortunately, a counterexample on that.
If we look at this elections in 2024 from a God's eye, 80,000-foot view, what are the big themes to you in terms of how social media and influence campaigns and AI affected them?
Well, let's start with the really big picture stuff, right? And many of your listeners will be familiar with this, but perhaps not all. People living in countries with half of the world's population had elections this year, right? So 4 billion people's worth of countries had elections. Of course, not 4 billion people could vote. There's a lot of children and so on. But this is the largest single year of elections the world has ever had. If you look at the state of the world 100 years ago, where very few countries had free and fair elections at all, this is, in the grand scheme of things, a great human achievement. But only half of the people who could vote were voting this last year, in elections that we'd think of as free and fair, right? So a couple of things to take from that. The first of which is that elections are happening everywhere. But then if only half of those people are in free and fair elections, what the hell is going on with those other elections, you might ask? And that's where I think we should feel a little bit more concerned about the state of global politics, that we are doing a simulacrum, if you like, of democracy in many countries. We're acting as if going to the polls and voting is process done. But in many countries, the most obvious being Russia, but we can talk about many others in today, that's not happening at all. So even before we get to social media, before we get to AI, we have a basic asymmetry. The half of the people in the world who went to polling booths this year were voting in real elections and the other half weren't. And let me say one final thing there. There's a great definition of democracy from the political scientist Adam Przeworski, and it's that democracy is a system in which parties lose elections. And the problem is, this year of elections, that was only true in half of those countries.
To sum up, I accept what you've said. In the countries that traditionally have free and fair elections, the elections were free and fair this year. Georgia has always had a problem with free and fair elections, and it's only been a country with elections since 1991. So that's not so surprising. But in places as disparate as Japan and India, where the incumbent party did less well than expected, there were free and fair elections. And even if you and I might dislike the results of some EU elections, in the US election, they happened, they were free and fair. So I accept that. But the big theme for me is anti-incumbency, Ben. Because if we look at what has happened from all these elections, and I'm talking Japan, India, the parliamentary elections for the EU, what you see is that sometimes incumbent parties have held on to power, but always with weakened majorities, as happened in India. And then even in countries where the economy was strong and the incumbents might have run a good campaign, they got turfed out. I might have my theories as to why this is the case, but despite my pretensions, I am not a professor of comparative democratic institutions at the University of Oxford. So I would like to turn to someone who is to ask, why this anti-incumbency wave?
The Financial Times data journalist John Byrne-Murdoch produced this incredibly viral graph,
which we will have a link to in the show notes.
Perfect. And what the graph shows you is actually not just since 1945, but John then extended it back to 1900. He looked at the change in vote share of incumbent governments in every single year in what he terms as major countries, so European countries, US, Canada, and so forth. This is the only year, 2024, where in every single one of those countries, the incumbents lost votes. They didn't always lose office, but they often did, because when you're losing 5 or 10% of votes in competitive systems, you're a goner. So why is that? Why has that happened? First off, it looks, if you look at John's graph, that things have just got more volatile over the last decade or so anyway. And so that might be just a change among voters, that voters have become more like consumers. I mean, we are all consumers in most of the countries that have elections in capitalist markets where we switch goods all the time. And I suppose there's reason to believe that we might switch parties all the time.
They say imitation is the greatest form of flattery, but maybe quoting someone's Substack back at him is an even greater form of flattery. And you wrote, and I quote, "After a long period of time in which two-term presidencies were the norm, think Clinton, Bush, Obama, maybe we're back in a world of 4-year cycles, more similar to the late 19th century, where from 1880 to 1896, there was a party switch every electoral cycle."
Yeah, that's right. So we're back in the world of Grover Cleveland in two ways, right? Because Grover Cleveland, large two-time US president, but two times with a gap in the middle, rather like Donald J. Trump. He's the only other person than Trump to have been a president who gets two numbers, right? Who comes in as 45 and then comes in as 47 in Trump's case. So I don't know if we want to draw too many parallels to the late 19th century, except to say that it was a troubled time in the economy, often in the US, but it was also a point at which the party system in the US was changing from one thing to another. I think that's been going on in the US case, right? That the coalitions that made sense since the 1990s, since the end of the Cold War, have stopped making sense, not least because the Republicans are now winning working class voters.
Yes, there was a realignment going on, but there are more parallels, I might argue, than just that. The late 19th century was a time not only of party realignment, but of increasing wealth inequality and of disruptive new technologies. Those were the oil-powered economy, the expansion of the railroads, the invention of the trusts. And we are having a tremendous technological disruption of our lives by the internet and AI, and the unbelievable consolidation of wealth into neo-robber barons. So maybe there are other things that you could draw out there, Ben?
Well, that's absolutely right, Jason. You have an era at the end of the 19th century, which is a heightening of globalization as well, a heightening of globalization that leads to populist backlashes. So for Donald J. Trump, don't read Grover Cleveland, read William Jennings Bryan, the famous prairie populist who wanted to get America off the gold standard, who talked that mankind should not be crucified on a cross of gold. That kind of populist argument, very, very successful at the end of the 19th century. And you have the emergence of other populist type leaders in the years after that, Teddy Roosevelt being the most obvious example. First as a Republican president, but then he runs his Bull Moose campaign afterwards. So that was a very fervent time. Of course, it ended in the First World War. I hope we don't have that parallel again. But I don't think it's a coincidence that very fast technological change that's globally spread makes people feel insecure, makes the mainstream party system feel unstable or unfitting, and creates possibilities and temptations for new leaders who can harness those fears and concerns.
And another connection is that when a party which ran on an anti-incumbent idea or wave came in, they didn't fundamentally change the principles that allowed people to hate the elites and the incumbent party. In other words, all of the potential political solutions didn't solve the problem until the breaking up of the trusts and the change in relative globalization that happened with World War I. So what I see going on here is that the Dems propose solutions. Oh, we're going to tax a little bit more, and we're going to take some things back from the wealthy, and we're going to, give you more free school meals, or we're going to fix the water company. But that's not enough, and it does nothing. And the right says, we're going to have these tariffs, we're going to this, we're going to that. But they don't actually put any taxes on the wealthy, and there's a greater consolidation of power, so that this anti-incumbency cycle might be accelerating. What do you think that would entail?
So if I was a Marxist, which sadly I'm not, I'd say this is heightening the contradictions, right? So we have this experience where promises are continually made by politicians to change the system, but generally there's actually double downing on the system. There's incrementalism from the technocratic left. There is kind of radical populism, in this case from the right, but a radical populism that doesn't actually pull the rug out from underneath the richest people in society. So I suspect that Trump will not, in fact, be trust busting.
Not.
Exactly. So what I suspect will happen instead is that the dissatisfaction will continue to bubble up. It's going to be more of a challenge if it does bubble up, as it may not, but if it does under Donald Trump, it's not clear what his response could be to that, because his whole MO is to complain about the way things are when he's in charge. Of course, that's going to be harder.
Yeah, sticking on this anti-incumbency theme, there was one country where the incumbents won and increased their majority, and that's not covered in the FT study that you cited, and that's Georgia, of course. So in Georgia, the incumbent Georgian Dream Party increased their majority relative to previous elections. I have some theories about that. What are yours?
I guess my theory about Georgian Dream is that a party that is sympathetic to Vladimir Putin, I think that's how I call them, possibly Russian-backed, but in a part of the world that feels disordered, right, feels unstable, is one where it's going to be easier to say to people, listen, you got to stick with us because the big guy is on our side and not on the opposition side, and he's going to cause trouble for you, right? So there's, I think, an implicit threat. Look what happened to Ukraine when they chose the other side. I don't think, that kind of logic works that well outside. I do think there's something else going on in Georgian politics, which is that there is a long-standing strain of social conservatism in Georgia about LGBT rights and other perceived changes in social norms in a pretty conservative country on the whole, and Georgian Dream have really picked up on that.
Yeah. So it's fun that we've nerded out a little bit about this Georgian election. And of course, we're going to come back to the state of Georgia in a little bit. But we haven't started our 30,000-foot tour around the globe. So I'd like to draw on your expertise to first look at the EU elections, the French parliamentary elections, before we move on to Japan, India, the rest of Asia.
Okay, yep, sure. So let's start with Europe. Now, Europe is a case where in the European elections, the populists did do well. And you've noted that, well, the populists did quite well in Georgia. One thing worth thinking about in terms of the incumbents this year is there's some dogs that didn't bark because Italy didn't have parliamentary elections this year. I suspect if it had done, Giorgia Meloni would have done very well. And we would be saying, oh, there is one incumbent who's done brilliantly and she's a populist. So we need to be a bit careful there in terms of who we're looking at. But it didn't work out wonderfully for the big conglomerations of European parties in the European Parliament. So that's the Socialist Group, and then the centre-right, the European People's Party, and the Liberals. All of them lost control to some degree, but they remain in charge of the European Parliament because the populist groups, there are two blocks of them in the European Parliament, don't have a majority. And so we have very, very recently now had agreement among all of those members of the parliament to vote in Ursula von der Leyen. She's the head of the commission, all of her cabinet. And we're going to be in a position where actually the politics in the European Parliament and in the Commission and in the EU in general looks quite a lot like it did a few years ago. It's still pretty centre-right with backing from the Liberals and from the Social Democrats, but with an ever larger kind of monster in the corner of the populist parties who are getting ever closer to being able to dominate that parliament.
I want to make a point about anti-incumbency, and then you can tell me if you felt that this happened at the EU parliamentary level. We are talking about lots of ways in which the current world makes incumbents do poorly. People are upset about inflation. They're upset about immigration. They're upset about the wars in Ukraine. They're upset about the war in Gaza. And whoever's in power is blamed for what's going on. But I have another thesis. What if one of the reasons incumbents are doing so much worse than before is that it used to be that incumbency allowed you and your wealthy friends to control the newspapers, and you and the people supporting you to use the institutions of government to control the narrative. But today, social media and the big corporations and lobbyists and outside disruptors like Elon and Vlad, they control the narrative. And it's much easier to radicalize with those platforms against. We're against this. We're against trans. We're against immigration. And it's very difficult to be for anything now. That the very nature of the way in which social media and the modern media ecosystem works is that outside disruptors can throw bombs. There's a conspiracy, they're eating the dogs. And therefore, it doesn't matter who is in power, social media and misinformation can attack what's being done. And it doesn't work to prop up whoever is in power.
I think what you're getting at there is that most people, generally speaking, prefer historically to be part of the consensus, to be conformist, and to sort of support the country, right? So a kind of silent majority is usually rallying around the flag and whoever's in charge right now, in the same way that most people, for good or for ill, support the New York Yankees in the tri-state area rather than diversifying across the. So people like to support winners, and there ought to be, and political scientists generally think there is, an advantage for incumbents because of that.
But not only that, control of the institutions.
Yeah, so there might be a kind of social norm, and then you have the institutional ability to push that norm through. So if you think, for example, about French politics, François Mitterrand and then Jacques Chirac, in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, a socialist and then a Gaullist conservative. They served their 2 maximum terms with high support, basically, from the French public. And ever since then, it's been impossible to be French president. Macron, of course, is the only one to serve 2 terms. Macron's approval ratings, nonetheless, are at about 20%. Sarkozy has been arrested and found guilty of criminal acts. Hollande left office with the lowest ratings ever. It's become much, much harder for incumbents to be popular. And I think there's a norm has shifted away from conformism and deference. I think it is fair to say that that's happened. I think maybe a norm has shifted to being a contrarian, to looking for conspiracies or to generally support the idea that everything's going wrong and we need to shake things up. And that's unusual in the last 100 years, but it's not that unusual in history.
Well said. I think that the connection between conspiracy theories and anti-incumbency is a very important one. It is one that I've sketched in my mind, but we haven't talked about overtly on the podcast. We're going to talk about it in the Substack, so you should join, everyone. What I want to get at, Ben, though, is how have these anti-incumbency media you can just bomb throw played out at the European level?
Here's an irony of Brexit, which is that Britain has left the EU, but the English language hasn't. So there is more ability for Europeans across different countries to speak to one another over social media. Now, of course, the European mainstream press in newspapers and TVs is in the national language, but Twitter is not. Twitter is largely in English. These groupings of national conservatives from Hungary to Italy to Germany are often communicating to one another in the lingua franca that is English. And that's the lingua franca of social media. So that's one big change in European politics. The other is that you can have this new alliance that I alluded to there of national conservatives that feels like it shouldn't work. So most of the groupings in the European Parliament are conglomerations based around different party ideologies that are kind of classic left-right, socialists, liberals, and conservatives. Now you've got these new groups where what they have in common is they each stand up for their individual nation. And it's kind of a weird thing to say. We've got a supranational institution made up of nationalists. And I think a lot of people poo-pooed that and said, oh, it'll never happen. But it's worked very effectively, this kind of Europe of nations and identities idea, this kind of mutual pact to not interfere with one another.
Tell us about the French parliamentary elections, Macron's trick on the back of his setback in the EU elections to go to French parliamentary elections, and how things played out in the UK where, yes, as we all know, the anti-incumbency party won, but they were the centrist kind of ordering party.
Yeah, so the similarity between the French and British elections is you've ended up with multi-party politics crammed into a 2-party set of electoral institutions. So Britain really does have this first-past-the-post voting system that really hurts third parties. But the French have a 2-round voting system that does something similar too. The problem is you have, in both countries, people now not just wanting to vote for the incumbent and the opposition or for classic left and right. They want to vote across multiple dimensions of politics, but our electoral institutions don't let them do that. And so it's going to be very volatile in both countries. So what happened in France? Well, Macron pulled a trick, as you said. After doing poorly in the French part of the European parliamentary elections, he essentially tried to call the bluff of Marine Le Pen's far right or populist right or whatever we want to call them, the Rassemblement National, by calling parliamentary elections and essentially saying, put up or shut up. And Macron more or less succeeded in that goal in the sense that when the Rassemblement National stood in all of these districts, ultimately they found that a majority of those districts were not going to fall behind them, that what's called the Republican Front, or the anti-Rassemblement National front of everybody else, coalesced against them. So they don't have a majority in France. We don't have a Prime Minister, Jordan Bardella. We don't have a far-right Prime Minister and Macron as a centrist president. What's the bad news for Macron? Well, the bad news is that Macron used to have his own majority in parliament of centrists, and they got completely decimated, leaving him in a very tricky situation because they were replaced in lots of situations by the French left, And Macron is also no friend of the French left, as the French left discovered when they rolled up to Parliament post these elections and said, great, we'll have a prime minister in a coalition with you. And Macron said, no, you won't. And he picked Michel Barnier, who long-time listeners of your show and others will remember as the EU's negotiator in Brexit, who is a pretty conservative guy, but not in the Rassemblement National, as the prime minister. So Macron has sort of annoyed everybody, but he's still in charge. And he has, to some degree, I think, succeeded in defanging Marine Le Pen. So that goal was successful.
Well, isn't she going to be defanged by her legal case as well? That one of the things that I notice about neopopulism everywhere, because I assert that it's a feature and not a bug, is criminality. Some people would say, oh, I voted for Trump despite the fact that he rapes women, or I voted for Trump despite the fact that he tried to steal the election, overthrow the government, take classified documents to Mar-a-Lago. I would assert people vote for it because of that. Netanyahu was in power in Israel, not despite the fact that he did campaign finance violations, but deliberately because of it. And therefore, even Marine Le Pen, in a very established and kind of safe neopopulism where she's no longer an anti-Semite like her father, is still guilty of criminality. And that's because I see it as a deliberate feature of neopopulism. Could you bring us up to speed with the case that she has against her and how that might play out?
This is a case for misusing funds, if I recall correctly, from the European Parliament, is it? I think for AIDS. So basically that you get a certain amount of money to support the party, and this money does not appear to have been spent on the purposes for which it was designated. Exactly where it went, I do not know. I mean, this is pretty standard political corruption stuff, if they are found to be guilty in that, and if she's charged. I do think, to your point about people being entirely willing to vote for populists, even despite these cases, most Rassemblement National voters will think one of two things. A, I don't care, or B, this is lawfare. This is the law being used to criminalize standard politics in ways that are asymmetric and biased against our side. And that's certainly how many Americans feel about the way that Donald Trump was treated. There are so many cases about Donald Trump that you can always find ones that are a bit weaker as well, right? In a way, paying off Stormy Daniels, which you got done on, might be one of the least of Donald Trump's sins. And so if you're a Trump voter, you might say, well, what's the big deal? Like, he channeled money through his lawyer to, pay someone off who was going to do a kiss and tell. That's just politics. This isn't real law breaking. And I suspect that Rassemblement National voters will feel similarly.
100%. I agree, but I will even go further, Ben. I'm going to say that they like that the establishment and the institutions and the laws are violated. These are these laws that just keep the elites in power anyway. So they say that you can raise funds in this way and not that way. So they say that it's okay to pay her money to have sex with you, but it's not okay if it comes through this vehicle, or he's allowed to do this with these secret papers, but not that. It's he got away with it. We love it. There is an excitement at the deviance. And I think that this is particularly true in the American, Hungarian, and Israeli cases because of a certain kind of frontier break down the establishment energy that doesn't necessarily apply to old Europe. But
yeah, I think that's right. So if this happened in Sweden, right, these people would be screwed. I mean, there's a great case in Sweden about a politician using a government credit card to buy a chocolate bar and having to resign. Okay, that's the kind of thing that you'd really struggle to fire someone for in most countries. It certainly wouldn't be a resignation basis. Whereas I think you're right to say that for many Americans, rule following just because they are the rules that are there is almost anti-American, or it's sort of missing the point. Right? And I think most of us actually can get that sensation. For most of us, lawyers and accountants are not dream professions. They're people we often distrust or we think are bean counting or are sweating, dotting the I's and crossing the T's and missing the big picture. So it's no surprise that many voters should think like that too.
And I, as an American, Ben, sometimes have difficulty in Europe when I'm told what the rules are. So I'm catering Thanksgiving dinner at my place. Usually I cook it. So I've called the caterers and I'm like, great, so you're going to bring me the whole turkey. Oh, no, we can't. Our insurance doesn't allow us to transport the whole turkey. We have to slice it the way that we would serve it at the restaurant and then transport it to you. I'm like, you're kidding me. no, we don't have an appropriate vehicle or vessel to transport it in. We have to have it in individually plastic things. I'm like, wrap it in aluminum foil and put it in a bag. No, I'd have to speak to the executive chef and the insurers. We're not going to be able to do that. And of course, being the bulldozing American that I am, I essentially threatened him. I said, I live here and tons more Americans are going to be coming here since this election. If you want me to recommend your thing, you're going to bring me this whole turkey so that I can reheat it in the oven and it's not going to dry out. Because once you slice the turkey, do you know what I mean? It gets dried out when you reheat it. But if it's the whole bird, it can go right in the oven and it will be like a freshly cooked turkey when I serve it. And this leveraged him and he's like, oh, okay, you have a podcast? Great, you're going to have the whole turkey there. After the break, our Around the World tour of elections continues with Ben Ansell. Tell us about Japan, India, Asia. What played out in 2024? This decrease of incumbent power.
Yeah, I mean, the Japan case is not enormously fascinating because whatever happens in Japan, the Liberal Democratic Party, who've largely been in charge of Japan since 1945, still end up in charge. So things are not enormously exciting there. They've lost a little bit. India is much more interesting. India is much more interesting because we thought it would go one way and it went the other. So Narendra Modi, the Indian Prime Minister, the head of the BJP, who are a kind of Hindu nationalist party, very successful at attracting kind of middle class and upper middle class people in India, which is an ever larger group, has been the dominant force for the last 2 decades or a decade and a half, replacing the previous dominant force, which was the Congress Party of Nehru and Indira Gandhi and so on. That was a party of the very well-to-do Brahmin Indians and then basically the poor. So this other party stuck up in the middle. It's doing really well, and it's extremely aggressive against Muslim minorities in India, which is one of the reasons why people outside of India worry so much about Narendra Modi. But that works pretty well in India, where 80% of the population are Hindu. So being a Hindu nationalist party is a feature, not a bug, for the BJP. And in the Lok Sabha, which is the Indian parliament, they have been commanding a large majority. And before the election, they had 350 out of around 600 seats. And they said, we're going to get 400, right? We're going up. Well, they actually ended up losing their majority entirely. So they went backwards. And the only reason they're still in power is because they had to ally with a couple of smaller parties, the Janata parties. So Modi has been weakened. That, I think, is the big surprise of the year. Maybe actually more surprising than Trump's re-election was Modi not continuing to become this ever kind of stronger strongman leader in India. There were concerns that India was becoming less democratic. I think what the Indians have shown is that, well, you still can lose elections in India, even if you're Narendra Modi. Indian democracy is quite vibrant. And I think that's actually the big good news of 2024.
No, thank you for putting it that way. Our listeners do need to hear some positive stories because we're trying to pick every little grain of hope and optimism to help us order this disorder. And I was so encouraged by the Indian election, and particularly the fact that Harris is herself half of Indian origin, that I thought that that provided some wind into her sails and that and developments with Keir would help her sufficiently. But India doesn't have enough pull on American elections. So if Japan is not a huge story, were there other elections, Latin America, Africa, elsewhere in Asia, that you think are of note?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of elections we should talk about. To continue our theme that actually, until Donald Trump got reelected, strongmen leaders had been doing quite poorly this year. So I think there was a good news story. So Modi being one example there. Erdogan, who is the president of Turkey, he didn't lose office because there wasn't a presidential election, but Erdogan's party, the AKP, did quite poorly across Turkish cities, Istanbul, Ankara, Izmir and places, such that essentially Erdogan has lost control of the major urban areas. Now, does this mean he will lose election next time he's up for office? Well, maybe not, but it does mean that what he's selling isn't being bought. Another good example of a strong man, but in this case, strong woman leader, losing out is Sheikh Hasina in Bangladesh. Now, these were weird elections.
It was kind of a coup more than elections.
Well, so she was already a quasi-authoritarian leader. There were elections in February. The opposition boycotted those elections. So obviously, in this case, Sheikh Hasina came back into power. But the important thing is the boycott worked over the long run because she had to leave office a few months later. Basically, it was unsustainable to try and remain in power, even in a pretty authoritarian country, without the electoral mandate. And so she's been replaced now by Muhammad Yunus, the microcredit guy who won the Nobel Peace Prize a few years ago. So I think that's encouraging as well. In terms of other successful strongman leaders, Latin America has a few interesting cases. So Javier Milei was elected as the president of Argentina. That wasn't this year, 2024, but it was in 2023. It's quite recent. And people thought he would be a total disaster. I think he probably is a disaster if you're an Argentinian civil servant, but he's still fairly popular because the alternative in Argentina is also a bunch of populists. It's the Peronists. So I suppose his particular election is in the kind of Trump model.
No, that's critical to point out, which is that when old school populism tries to stand up to neopopulism, it's been crushed over the last 10 years. We're not seeing so many Sanders and Corbyn style populists, which I would call old school, almost Marxian populism, because that no longer resonates with the youth. They feel that Marxism is, gone the way of the Soviet Union. They're not interested.
Well, there's one maybe counterexample to that, which is Mexico, right? So in Mexico, Manuel Lopez Obrador, who was leader, AMLO, he, because of Mexican law, wasn't able to stand for re-election. So his protege, Claudia Sheinbaum, she won quite definitively, which brings to an end what's been happening in Mexico, a bit like late 19th century America, which is this constant going back and forth between different political parties in the presidency every few years. Now the left in Mexico only get 2 terms. But that's really, I think, the only example of successful left populism over this period of time. And actually, we didn't mention, so we'll come back to him, Keir Starmer. He won a sizable parliamentary victory. He has 2/3 of the seats in parliament, a rather disappointing victory in terms of votes, because Labour only got just over 1/3 of votes in the UK, but he didn't win it on a left populist agenda at all. It was very much on a safety first incumbent replacement.
And I thought that meant that Harris could do the same by saying, now I support fracking, and now I'm not in favor of transgendered surgeries in prisons, that she could pivot to the center. But she seems to have been far more tarred by previous statements, whereas Keir was able to be flexible. I think it also showcases that having the right operator is critical, whereas the operators around Biden and Harris, they didn't pull the candidate at the right moment. They didn't have the debates at the right moment. She did well in the debate against Trump, but it didn't help them. We lost the VP debate. We didn't use the ad buys correctly. I mean, people are going to forget, but Harris outspent Trump nearly 2-1 and outraised him. And yet it was their ad against transgendered with the punchline, Harris is for they, them, Trump is for you, that killed all the Democrat ads. We don't have an ad that is going to be even remembered. So I would just bring the Keir factor down to the McSweeney factor, which is that we don't have in the States someone of the James Carville or David Axelrod level. And for those of us in the political game, it's the political operator behind the president. For every W. Bush, there's a Karl Rove. For every Clinton, there's a James Carville. And for every Obama, there's a David Plouffe and David Axelrod. And who even knows who Harris's people were? Because they were so lame, they weren't able to do anything.
Well, so here's the interesting thing about the Harris campaign is they brought David Plouffe in, the mastermind of 2008 with Axelrod, as you noted. They brought him in to help run the campaign. And the problem they had with that is that you can't run 2008 in 2024.
No, of course, they need young blood. I mean, you can't redo it. Yeah.
But it also didn't work because American politics the territory has shifted from assembling victories based around what I call the Lego brick strategy, where you take different groups that you know will vote for you and you assemble as many of them as they can. And those groups differ around some kind of characteristics, demographic characteristics like being Latino, being African American, being Asian American, being a woman under 35, and so on and so forth. That worked very well in the Obama era. it has stopped working so well really since 2016. And American politics has actually shifted into what us political scientists would be very happy with, which is kind of classic median voter politics, where you're just trying to shift the territory in sort of in the middle, where you can pick up 50, 52, 53% of people by targeting big mass messages at people.
Well, that was a good tour of the whole world of elections, but I feel that we might have missed one. Moldova. I mean, when I think of places that are important in the world, it's Transnistria. And frequently when I am in my Hampstead, burrow under the hills of Hampstead, escape the world liberal elite bubble, and people say, what did you work on today? And I'll say, the Transnistrian question. So tell us what happened in Moldova, Ben.
So Moldova had two important elections. Had a presidential election, and it had an election about joining the EU. So a referendum on whether Moldova should basically get in line to join the EU, start on the process of what's called the acquis, which is basically changing your laws so that you can move towards that. Both of those passed in the pro-EU direction in the sense that the referendum did, but also the president, which was actually tighter, Maia Sandu, the pro-EU president, she was re-elected. There was lots of Russian interest in that election, presumably lots of Russian propaganda, presumably also spread through Transnistria. You mentioned the territory that nominally belongs to Moldova but has split itself off on the other side of the Dniester. So I think that's a successful one from the perspective of the EU. It was rather overshadowed by what happened in Georgia, which went in the opposite direction. But until the Georgian election and the US election, if you were a kind of liberal elite in Europe, actually you could rub your hands with some comfort about how elections had gone for you over the course of the year.
So we've done a survey now, Ben, from the 30,000-foot perspective of what went down in 2024, this year of greatest elections, and we highlighted the anti-incumbency trend, but we also pointed out that in many instances, strongman leaders didn't do that well, and we even had the success of left-wing populists in places like Mexico. We talked at the end now about defeating Russian desires in Moldova while people pivoting towards staying safe with Russia and peace in Georgia. But I want to ask you, if you're sitting in the Kremlin or in Beijing and you're giving a scorecard to the boss, how did we do in the disinformation wing of the Kremlin? And how did we do in the Chinese intelligence of influencing these global elections? What are they telling their bosses? How did they do? How did their influence make itself felt?
They'd give themselves a B grade. I don't think the Russian influence was as important in this presidential election as it was in 2016. And I think that is in part because whatever tactics worked then are much easier for the social media companies to spot now. The Russians also pivoted a bit, right? I mean, the Tenet media case is the most interesting one. This was the discovery that right-wing shows, video, sort of online watchable TV shows with well-known conservative hosts were being funded directly by the Russians. So I'm presuming that that was the tip of the iceberg and there are other things similar in that. This could be in one of those cases, though, of the Russians simply sort of putting more money behind people who think that way anyway. In other words, there is a large, and always has been a very large audience for right-wing radio, certainly since the 80s, and right-wing TV since the 90s. And the Russians throwing extra money at that might supercharge it, but I suspect it would have happened anyway. In terms of the influence that they have, I mean, you could look actually at countries like Austria might be a better example for where the Russians have done rather well. The Austrian elections were won by the Freedom Party of Austria, FPÖ. So the FPÖ, the Austrian Freedom Party, were associated in the 1990s with this guy, Jörg Haider, who was one of the original kind of smiling, handsome, far-right populists, who then, of course, turned out to have lots and lots of skeletons in his closet.
Some of them Gaddafian skeletons.
Yes, indeed. But he's no longer with us. But the FPÖ haven't really cleaned up that much. And there are all kinds of links with the FPÖ to Russian money that have come out over the last few years and roiled Austrian politics. And look, the important thing is that might be the case, and they might be against the war in Ukraine, or at least against the West being in Ukraine and pro-Russian, but they still won the election. The Austrians were willing to vote them in as the largest party. So if you're in the Kremlin, You can look over at Austria. You can look at the election of Fico in Slovakia last year. You can look at Georgia. And you can feel fairly comfortable that there are lots of Eastern European countries, all the way through to the Caucasus, who are quite pro-Russian still.
Very good point. But on Chinese influence, we heard about the Chinese trying to hack Vance's and Trump's personal phone. Did that have any impact? Did the Chinese try to put their thumb on the scale of either the US or UK election? How do we understand about how Chinese intelligence operates relative to democratic elections? They're obviously technologically sophisticated. Have they done bits of misinformation and AI affecting social media?
Yeah, it's hard to know. I'm not an expert on Chinese misinformation, so I'm going to talk about the cases I know. That the Chinese have been successful at, for example, placing people around politicians. That, I think, has been their most successful strategy, is basically having aides who work in parliaments or who work in Congress and get close to politicians. It's a little bit more like the kind of old Soviet spy work than it is Russian troll farms. So that's one angle that they've been going at for influence. In terms of hacking, in terms of social media, I mean, they're obviously if not the major player. It's not clear to me that the hacking of Vance or Trump's phone had very much effect at all. There was a lot of talk about, and it was also the Iranians went after those phones. There was a lot of talk about why is this stuff not being released in the way that Hillary's information was. But then it transpired that whatever parts did leak out just weren't that compelling.
So we've been talking a little bit about Russian, Chinese, and slightly Iranian influence on elections. One of the things that I'm deeply disappointed in is the inability of the US and UK to influence other democracies' elections. We have USAID, they help opposition groups in Georgia, and they fund women's rights movements in minor democracies like in Moldova and in Latin America, but it doesn't seem to do anything. So how would you rate how the US and UK influence other democracies' elections?
There's two ways of looking at this. One is to say liberal democracies put themselves at a disadvantage in this grand game by being liberal democracies and by having principles, not completely of non-interference, but certainly principles that there should be free and fair elections worldwide, and therefore not being willing to influence elections through foul means at all. That was clearly not true, of course, for the CIA in the 1980s, but I think that has become ever more true. The downside, of course, for the West in doing that is that that's fighting potentially with one arm tied behind your back in terms of influence, where the Russians and the Chinese are not beholden to those kinds of commitments.
Of course, in the Cold War, we had influence operations that were working on Latin American elections, but even on Italian elections. Back in the period right after World War II, it was critical for the CIA to prevent the rise of communist parties in Europe. And we not only gave money to the center right, but also to the center left to keep the communists out. And, we had major influence operations. And there were some conspiracy theories about them, but not as many conspiracy theories as there are now. And yet now we're not even intervening that much in other people's politics. So today's conspiracy theories seem to be more like what's called the paranoid style in American politics. And I'm going to put an article in the show notes that I wrote for the New European about this, paranoid style and how democratic politics the world over is being waged. And my view is that in America, it resonates more with voters than in the UK or Northwestern continental Europe. But in Eastern Central Europe and America, this paranoid style resonates. So for you, as someone, Ben, who's studying democracy and whether democracy works or not, I have a fear that the more the paranoid style comes to dominate how issues are discussed, the less democracy really can work. Because, yes, there may be elections and they may even be free and fair. In other words, the votes are tallied accurately. But the issues that are being debated and campaigned on are not the ones which are needed to govern, and therefore the election is in a way rigged by not being about the correct issues.
Yeah, let me give an addendum to that, which is one hugely important thing for democracy to function well is the idea of losers' consent. That if you lose the election, you consent to having lost, and you say, okay, we fought a fair fight and we lost. And if you're the winner, you don't just use the fact that you've won to crush the opposition. So in other words, you look for some consent.
Which they will do in Georgia now.
Yeah, absolutely. And arguably this happened with Brexit, right? The losers, the Remainers, often argued that, well, actually, we didn't really lose because lots of people didn't vote, or, well, this referendum wasn't binding. And certainly the winners had absolutely no interest in a Brexit that the losers could stand at all, right? So this is quite a common experience. Now, why is that a problem if you have this kind of paranoid style in politics? Well, it means that losers of elections are much more likely to say it was rigged. If you don't believe that people are telling the truth, if you think that there are conspiracies to pervert the kind of true course of events, then you're not going to give your consent as a loser. And we saw that between 2020 and 2024 in the US, with many, many Republican voters refusing to admit that Donald Trump could have lost that election. So the paranoid style is not new in American politics. In fact, it was around in the Founding Fathers era, with concerns in among the Founding Fathers about the Illuminati from Bavaria, then the Freemasons, then the Catholics and the Jews, and eventually up through the 1950s with the communists. Right? And so the John Birch Society and other anti-communist groups, the McCarthy hearings, all of this is not old in American politics.
Well said. I really like that analysis. But back to the paranoid style, the reason I wanted to bring it up is I believe that this dominance of the paranoid style might be one of the crucial ways that Trump, quote unquote, ends democracy. Most people think it's going to be just by ripping up the Constitution or destroying the institutions. But what if it's simply that by injecting so much paranoia into our debate that people are no longer choosing or voting based on maximizing their interests. They're voting based on, we need to keep the Soros elite out, so I'm voting for Trump to, clean up those institutions. And I'm afraid that these debates mean that we can't have genuine democracy anymore.
I am a glass half full person about American democracy because I don't think this debate is new. I think it's basically the debate not conducted directly, because they didn't live at exactly the same time, but between James Madison on the one hand and Andrew Jackson on the other. There has always been a kind of institutionalist America we associate with James Madison and separation of powers. We've seen the separation of powers play out already, even before the Trump administration begins, with the Attorney General pick of Matt Gaetz essentially being derailed by conversations with Republican senators who value their remaining power, even while the presidency, the House, and the Senate are all Republican. But there has always been this Jacksonian tradition, too, of giving it to the man, trying to break down the institutions, of seeing conspiracies in the establishment that was very successful in the early part of the 19th century in America. So I think those two traditions are not new. And ultimately, Jacksonism was contained, as I think Trump will be, and he'll be maybe contained by Republican rivals who, ultimately use their kind of Madisonian advantage of controlling the institutions to push back. But I don't expect it to be a fun ride for many Democrats over the next few years.
Wow, you're a natural-born mega orderer, Ben, because you believe that Trump can be contained and that whether or not there's a conspiratorial style and a paranoid style in American politics, that the mainstream right can try to check him. I don't see things that way. Let's move to the ordering the disorder, where it seems like you are going to be more optimistic and more ordering than I could be. What I see is that mainstream right-wing movements have lost all of their moral courage. Mitch McConnell could have gotten rid of Trump and impeached him a second time for Jan 6th and didn't. The mainstream Tory party could have said, after the Brexit referendum, we're using the Queen in Parliament theory to not have hard Brexit or any Brexit. Then they could have said, we're going to face down the ERG and stay in the common market, even if we have Brexit. They did none of that. They showed no moral courage. So I believe that they won't have any moral courage and that Trump will be eviscerating our democracy. But we turn to you, the mega orderer. Question 1, can we say that new ways are needed to prevent non-democracies from discrediting the very concept of democracy and the establishment?
Well, non-democracies have the weakness that they don't end up tending to be that stable over the long run unless they're Singapore or maybe, if you squint, China. So it's not clear to me that they are a great rival in terms of being an example for smaller countries around the world unless they pressure them that way. I mean, ultimately, smaller countries around the world are still going to look at which wealthy countries have had high levels of growth over the last few years. And that's the United States of America, right? So, I mean, the US keeps bouncing back in this particular case. Now, the fact that the US is, of course, associated with Donald Trump doesn't make this argument quite as easy to follow through on. But I suspect that the attraction of looking like China or Russia is not as huge as people think it is, unless you're another would-be dictator in one of those countries, in which case that might look great.
Okay, question 2. So you would argue that elections work in the age of social media. I might think that they don't. But what can we do to have social media less influence and less pervert the course of our elections?
Well, we're stuck with social media whether we like it or not, because I don't think we're going to find any way to regulate something that's ultimately transnational. It would require regulating American companies for countries that aren't America. So that's going to be very hard. It's going to be hard to have a kind of great firewall of Belgium. So I suspect that it will be a challenge to stop social media. So that's with us. I do think that Elon Musk might have cut the floor out from underneath him a little bit by making Twitter so much worse. Not necessarily worse because it's become more right-wing. We can have those debates, but worse just because it's an unusable experience for much of the time. And so what we have seen, obviously with the rise of Blue Sky being the phenomenon of late 2024, is that the market in social media has allowed alternatives to open up. I mean, the real danger would be is if we had to choose between just Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and Threads. But it looks like there's still enough openness in social media funding and organization to have alternatives. So the worry I would have is if we were just stuck with the big tech guys.
On to question 3. How can we combat the spread of conspiracy theories that undermine democracy?
Well, the BBC have tried very hard to do this. They have a unit called BBC Verify that spend all of their time trying to combat conspiracy theories. The conspiracy theorists hate it. And they spend all of their time attacking Mariana Spring and people like that and saying, oh no, they're the real conspiracy theorists, or they're engaged in lawfare. Ultimately, I think countries that have trusted sources of information are in a much better position to do this. That's true in the UK, where the BBC really remains a highly trusted source of information. That's very hard to do in the United States. I don't think there is a single news source that has unequivocal trust among people. If you look, for example, at popular levels of trust among different media outlets in the States, barely any of them hit 50%. The UK has 15 of them over 50%. So how you do that in America, that's a very, very difficult challenge.
Last but not least, we love to end the Disorder Pod by asking those with access to information at a higher ethereal plane than mere mortals like me could hope to achieve. People who occupy positions like professing the nature of democratic institutions. If you were king for a day and you could make a global institution to safeguard the functioning integrity of democracies, what would it be?
Well, it's not easy being king, is it?
I wouldn't mind personally, but that's just my personality.
You know, first thing I'd say is we're not doing everything that badly right now. And I don't think that coming in, you know, I often say the scariest words in the English language aren't "I'm from the government, I'm here to help you." It's "I'm from the University of Oxford and I'm here to help you." That having, you know, a single solution, you know, probably isn't going to work. I think a norm, though, of making voting easier is one that it would be nice to encourage everywhere. In a funny way, actually, America has good lessons for other countries here, because despite the fact that it's been so politicized in America, going to vote has become much easier. Early voting, voting by mail, voting by proxy, all of those things that we lack in the same extent, at least in Europe. There are ways to make the process of voting a slightly longer run process, right? So people can do it at different times, and therefore it's not, by the way, affected by things that happen the day before the election. After all, we're voting over the next 4 years. We shouldn't be voting over the news item of the day before an election, and that ultimately push turnout up. And what I will say about America, I mean, I realize I'm making it sound like MAGA has brought order to America, and that's emphatically not true. But turnout in the last 2 American elections has been higher than in any other presidential election since the start of the 20th century. That's a good thing. We might not like the fact that it's produced Donald Trump as president again, but I think it has to be unequivocally a good thing if you care about the votes of the many to have many votes.
Who am I to quibble with that? So, Ben, thank you for ordering the disorder with us. I learned a tremendous amount from you, and I feel that you put into perspective, both geographically and historically, some of the trends we've been facing. I hope that you will rejoin us and regale the mega orderers sometime soon.
Thank you so much for having me, Jason. I always like to put a little bit of whiskey in the water to calm everybody down.
It goes down smoother. So if you've enjoyed today's episode, please follow the link in the show notes to subscribe to the Substack, where you'll hear more about Ben's theories. And we're going to talk about his book, Why Politics Fails, as well as some of the other interesting things that he's put out about how to interpret developments in global democracy over the last years. As always, this episode has been produced by the one, the only, the guarantor of electoral integrity, George McDonough, and our executive producer, Neil Fern. I am hoping you a very orderly and very democratic week. Until then.